Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's web briefing, part of our weekly offerings for elite members, now with a crisis recovery focus. My name is Meena Dayak, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Market Intelligence at Open Minds. I will serve as your moderator today. I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, George Braunstein, who is currently a Senior Associate at Open Minds, and he will be speaking on the topic Service line portfolio management in pandemic recovery planning, making the tough decisions. And this session addresses some of the critical questions every provider, organization, executive team needs to ask themselves in this era of crisis and disruption. Are all of your current service lines profitable and viable? What should stay and what should go? Are there new market needs you can respond to with new services? These are tough decisions to make as we slowly emerge, from a crisis of unprecedented proportions. But these are decisions that must be made now because maintaining the status quo is really not an option for survival and sustainability. So George Braunstein, who has served as the Executive Director of Community Behavioral Health Organizations throughout his career, will present the insider perspective on 3 key steps for portfolio analysis and management. And before I hand it over to him, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about his experience and his credentials. George has 40 years of experience in the health and human service industry, leading both public and private organizations in institutional and ambulatory settings. And while working with Open Minds, he has completed an array of projects from strategic planning for IDD and brain injury services to mergers and acquisitions. He is comfortable tackling challenges in any health and human service environment. And prior to joining Open Minds, he served as executive director of the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board in Virginia, which provides community-based mental health, substance abuse, and developmentally disabled services. And during his 6-year tenure with the CSB, which had a $150 million plus budget and over 1,200 employees, George both reduced the budget and increased service access. And before Fairfax, he was the executive director of the Chesterfield County Community Services Board, and he also was the executive director of behavioral health for Aurora Healthcare in Milwaukee, the largest integrated healthcare system in Wisconsin with 13 hospitals, 20,000 employees, and $1.5 billion in annual revenues. He also brings considerable managed care experience to the Open Minds team, having served as the director of behavioral health for Family Health Plan Cooperative, a Wisconsin HMO. He's a certified clinical specialist in adult psychiatry and is a licensed advanced practice nurse practitioner in the state of Wisconsin. So we are really glad that George, who has this inside perspective, is the one talking to us about portfolio management today. And before I hand it off to him, a couple of housekeeping reminders. Today's web briefing is being recorded, so you are currently muted. But at any time, if you have questions or suggestions for George, or if you want to share a comment, please use the question box on the right of your screen and just chat your question or comment into us, and we will ask George right after he finishes his presentation. Also, a slide deck from today's presentation, as well as a complete video recording, will be available on the Open Minds website. And I guess we are coming into a long weekend, or I would have said will be available tomorrow, but at this point I want to say it will be available on Monday, July 6th, and we will send you an email as well. So thank you all for taking the time to join us at the start of this long weekend. We appreciate you being with us. And with that, George, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Meena, and welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to discussing with you about service line portfolio management. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at where you are today or where you likely are, what kind of strengths and skills you have, the right tools that you'll need, and then the 3 steps to getting yourself in a position where you know what you want to do with your services that you have had or the services that you are planning to develop. So our objectives will allow you to kind of take some time or help guide you towards looking at yourself, where you are today, where you think you need to go based on an ever-changing environment, understandably, and how to use tools effectively to help you make some decisions that have some far-reaching implications, even though things are changing very rapidly on you on a regular basis right now. During March and April, and actually into May, you deserve a lot of credit, because what you've done is you've taken your service system into a major crisis mode. I guess there's nothing quite parallel to this in our history of community mental health. But if we were to take a look at it, it's basically the same kind of crisis mode that a number of us worked with during 2011, and even more so during the 2008 economic collapse, or almost economic collapse. But essentially what you did is you went into a crisis mode, making sure your staff were safe, making sure consumers were safe, making sure that you could address each and every fire, put out those little fires that kept coming up. You had to expand your virtual services to the point where you became almost solely virtual service. That's a real accomplishment, and you deserve a lot of credit, because very few organizations were in that position to be able to do that without a lot of hustling and putting a lot of pieces together, including training staff and putting all that those resources online. And plus, we had to manage costs because cash flow became the most important thing, and you couldn't allow yourself to make expenditures that would put you into serious debt. Some of the observations and results that I've heard is that from clients that I've worked with and from others, is that actually productivity increased in a number of instances. Access in some cases improved virtual services. You saw a potential to decrease your overhead costs if you stayed virtual. And I've also heard that in some instances, because of the concerns and fears of sending people into hospitals or residential facilities, more community-based alternatives have been developed as just a way of serving consumers who don't want to go, and serving people who cannot go into some of these facilities. So now where are you? Where you are is generally trying to recover and create some sense of stability and sustainability. Every state has guidelines for how you're going to open, but you're still going to do a lot of virtual services, at least for the time being. Actually, in your budget, what a lot of folks are probably experiencing is that your last year's budget, or the budget that's about to end in this fiscal year, or is just ending, you're going to find that it wasn't as bad as you thought, because you probably got some help from the federal government, or you got from the state, or your tightening of things was enough. But now you're looking at trying to get more services up and running in a very challenging environment. And so your budget going into the next fiscal year is going to be very, very challenging. And so, because services is what you're all about, what are you going to do about services? Are you going to restore all the services that you had to shut down temporarily? And what are you going to provide sooner than later? What is your new business plan, essentially? One of the things that I strongly recommend is that if you haven't already done this, and I'm talking about it more recently, not something you've done several years ago. Sit down with your executive team and even possibly some of your middle managers who are strong leaders, and just just step back for just a short time and look at the strengths you have and look at what you bring to this new world you're in, to this crisis and recovery environment you're in. Who on your executive team has that ability to take on projects and make adjustments? How will your service system respond to that balance you have to create with consumers' needs versus cost management? You've probably developed some really good communication tools for the staff, the consumers, and the community at large. Now's the time to actually enhance them, not put them away, because as you're going through the process of deciding who you're going to be and what services you're going to provide, communication is going to be key with all the stakeholders. And you have to include payers and regulators, if you haven't already, as part of that stakeholder group. So what are the tools you need to go into when you're looking at how you're going to manage your portfolio of services? I've identified 4 areas that are very important for you to know that they're in the right mode or right position for you to go about either restoring services, closing services, building new services, whatever you're planning to do. These 4 things need to be in place and as strong as you can make them. One of the things that we all have is at some point we've looked at our mission, vision, values, and created a strategic plan around them. In going into this time, what we have to do is we have to focus ourselves on, in this short term, in this shorter sequence of time, 6 months, a year, is our mission and vision at all going to get us in a position where we are going to insist upon keeping a service alive that is going to hurt the overall operations of an organization? So looking at your mission and vision right now, make sure that the mission and vision is clear enough that you can build a set of short-term strategic and business goals around them. And if you need to, you may go over this with your board, but make sure your mission and vision doesn't become a barrier to successful movement towards a successful, sustainable organization in this new environment. Market and business opportunities and threats are very important, and they will play into your decisions about what you do about your services. I would say one of the most important steps you can take in the very near future, if you haven't already, consider payers as customers and potential partners. I know that at times, especially managed care organizations, there's a sense about them that can be adversarial. They want to tighten up everything. They're doing all these audits on your services that you think you've done a great job with. What I'm suggesting is work on the idea that you won't be able to develop new services or expand existing services without the payers being part of the planning mix. They're customers, and most major successful healthcare systems have already learned that, and that's why they are able to do some of the expansion that they do. take a look in your environment for things like service gaps, who's developing new services out in your environment. And don't just look at your traditional standing services with buildings. Be aware of any virtual services that are coming online in your environment, because there are some national organizations that are coming online throughout our country and getting contracts to do virtual services. So you need to understand your market from a broader perspective. But there are going to be service gaps, and there are going to be service gaps in your market and in adjoining geographic areas. Make sure you understand what's involved in bringing back services, and because it's going to take more resource and effort to bring them back than it did to make them run before you had to shut them down. Make sure as you decide to expand your virtual models or even maintain them, that you begin to get a little more sophisticated about understanding what's a good model for virtual service, where you be able to show people, that you show your payers and show your regulators that you're providing a good outcome, that you can measure that, in addition to being able to measure that it's cost effective. And also consider the skill sets you have and whether you can diversify. Data. Anyone who has worked with Open Minds has seen that data is very important. Well, what's important about the data is it needs to be valid and reliable. And it needs to be valid and reliable in a way where it can create information you can use. So it needs to be consistent. You need to be able to use it to measure key performance. And if you've got that in place, it can help you drive decisions that otherwise you're going to be guessing about. So make sure your data is as good as you can make it. And then if you have to measure less things but measure them well, you're better off doing that than getting a big spreadsheet full of numbers that don't help you make decisions. Lastly, the tool that I think we sometimes overlook is effective planning and leadership. Now, when I talk about leadership, I'm not talking about just executive team, but I am talking about people who can take control of a given project, and projects in this sense will be bringing back services you're trying to bring back. It'll be creating new services. It may even be, how do you, if you're going to close a service, how are you going to close it with the least impact on people who relied on that service? So any project you put in place, where are those strengths? Who can do good leadership in practice? Who's flexible enough that if conditions change, they can make the kind of changes they need? Do you have a transparent communication style among your leadership team so that everyone knows where things are at and how projects are going? And I can't emphasize this more. If the CEO and the CFO are the only ones making decisions, then this could become a serious problem for the organization, because the CEO and the CFO are going to get caught up in still putting out some fires, in dealing with outside pressures that will come about. So you need to be able to have the ability to delegate not just responsibility, but authority to the people who you're going to have do these projects. And it's always a good idea to be somewhat redundant in how leadership is about projects, so that projects that if the leader is not available or can't continue on the project, someone can pick it up and move it on, especially if it's very important. Now you've got tools, you know your strengths, So now it's time to talk about how you manage your portfolio. You're really answering these 4 basic questions, and they become even more important and more demanding upon you because the decisions you make, even if the decision is to stand pat and not do anything other than what you've always done, those decisions will have a major impact as the market starts to take shape and others are creating new services or creating their own models of care around you. So your ability to answer these questions are going to be vital. There are 3 steps to be able to analyze and manage a portfolio, and I'm going to go through them in some detail with you, but I'm also trying to give you some idea that there is a lot of flexibility in how you do this. When you're, however you currently manage your services, whether they are called services, programs, population-based, or very discrete services that are based on payers, it doesn't matter right now. However you have them organized in terms of how you budget and how you work with them, that's what you will now call your business unit. And I'm going to use the term business unit interchangeably with services right now, because for the purposes of this exercise, these are business units. These are units that will make a difference as to whether you're able to continue that service and how much of a drain, if it's not, if it's got a negative margin, how much of a drain it will have on your other services. And if you've been balancing it in the past, coming back now, you have to make sure your business units work and the ones that you choose to use. There's a variety of ways that I'm going to give you some examples of, but there are other ways that you can use spreadsheets, graphs, pie charts to show you how your data on your service or business units looks. You are going to have to adapt your data to this like dual system. So you're going to be looking at what you've been doing in the past and what trends you see in the past, but you're going to have to add on what's been happening over the last 4 months and have that alongside and see what that trend looks like as well. So you don't want to make decisions just on what happened in the last 4 months, but you can't ignore what happened in the last 4 months. One of the most common examples of how you organize your data, of course, would be profit loss. One of the things I want to emphasize here, because I work with organizations that work with just direct costs for each business unit without looking at the overhead costs that go into running the organization and supporting that business unit. Saying that, and I'll give you an example here at the top one, outpatient mental health. You're looking at the profit loss without overhead expenses as already being substantial. Out of the 8 million revenue, you're losing 1.2 million. But what happens when you start adding in the overhead costs and the actual service really costs you 3.2 or almost 3.3 million? And the reason that I want you to understand that is that 17% overhead cost, if it's not included in how you're looking at your service lines or your business units, then you might be missing a key decision point about the viability, about how well they'll do in the future. So be aware of that, because it can become a trap where people feel like in their direct costs of just their services, and I've had this experience myself, everything looks great or doesn't look as bad. So be aware of that. Another way of looking at it, especially those of you, and a number of you I'm sure have multiple locations, you can look at the profitability based on different locations. And especially when you compare services and locations, you begin to see which service is doing well or not doing well. And it gives you some idea of what the different sites that you have are doing. Another way of looking at it, and I think one that's highly valuable when you're looking at productivity and managing cost, is looking at unit cost. You can also look at unit revenue for very distinct specific services, but what you're looking at is how well you manage the cost of delivering a service. And when you're in a fee-for-service environment, that's going to be really important in terms of how this looks. You definitely want to see how your payers are paying you and where most of your pay is coming from. This is a inpatient hospital example, but we're going to show you some other ones because most of you are community-based. Revenue mix by payer here is a narrow number of payers, but giving you an idea of where all your money is coming from. And in this particular case, if it's heavily in one area of payer versus another, then you know which payers you have to start partnering with and working with, but you also know where you might need to grow some more revenue. Another way of looking at something very similar is a pie chart. Whatever visual helps you make the connections you need to make. So in this particular case, you've got two very big payer sources and everything else is very minor. And are there ways of growing any of these smaller ones? Do you anticipate some of these larger ones getting smaller? Like, for example, in the environment we're in, anyone who is looking at funds that come from block grant states is concerned that you may get less funding as budgets are starting to develop where all government services are running major deficits. So when you're looking at something like this, well, if this 55% on this pie chart goes down, are you going to be able to increase your commercial or other types of funds to make up the difference? Or if not, how are you going to manage your portfolio? Another way of looking at your data to give you a picture of what you've got is where is your revenue coming from a service line standpoint? How is it going? What are your services doing for you? And you can see this gives you a 3-year trend, and in this particular instance, it's a pretty stable trend, but I'm guessing that if I was to look at most of yours, that the trend might not look as stable as this in some instances because of changes in how payers were working with you already before the virus and pandemic. Another way of visualizing where the revenue is in each service line is something like this. And another way of visualizing how your services are how your revenues are working. Another way will be that you can look at the percentage of revenues by service line and business location. So there's a variety of ways you can look at how you're doing and what you're doing. And these examples are not the only examples. There's a variety of ways that these examples can be used. What's important here is looking at 2 to 3 year trends to the best of your ability based on the data you have. That's why I recommended earlier in this talk, make sure that you use the business units based on how you manage now. Don't try to recreate new business units at this moment. Just see what you're doing now. You're going to look at both you're going to look at both how things have trended over the last 2 to 3 years, in addition to this most recent times. What you're looking for is you're looking for the performance of the business unit, and the business unit performance will be around the revenue, the margins, cost management. So make sure that you're looking at it that way, because it does not mean that the final decision is always about margins. But what it does mean is if you don't understand this part, then the mission-driven services that you're doing, you won't understand how to manage or make decisions about those. So as you organize your data, what you're going to do is you're going to look at business unit models for key trends, as well as market information that tells you where you stand in your markets, how much, what are the payers paying you, is there growing demand, what are the factors of success for you in your business units, and looking at each of them in a distinct way. Once you've got that data and your inputs from understanding your markets and what's going on with your payers, then you can organize your data into a visual for yourself that will show you how to make these kind of decisions you're going to need to make about what you're going to do. And so, for example, especially mission-driven organizations, how are your services doing? And using these 4 grids gives you an idea, because there are a lot of very mission-driven services that you might be doing where you've got a negative fiscal outcome. But some of them, you have to be discreet about each one, because some of them could be close enough. The ones in the upper left-hand corner could be getting a little closer to that line that divides and gets you closer to break even, and there could be just an intervention needed. Whereas those, for example, are in the lower left-hand corner, can you afford to continue to keep that service in the environment that you're moving into? Could you have afforded to keep it before? Maybe. But can you continue to afford to keep it? Look very discreetly at each of the services. What are you going to do about the ones that are highly profitable yet are not as mission mission critical? Well, do they help support you keeping those services that are more mission driven but have some negative outcomes financially? So look at this, and it should help you begin to see each of your business units, what you might need to do about them. Another way, especially if you're in more of a mode of looking at your market share and where there's a potential market growth, but you can see that using these terminologies, you could easily apply them on the other grid as well. The ones in the upper right-hand grid are stars, because they have potential great growth, potential great market share, but they're probably, if you combine the two, I'll bet you your stars would show up also. Your stars would also show up very similarly to your mission and margin discussion. So once you've taken a look at your portfolio in some kind of grid like that, or you can look at it in any way that helps you understand which of your business units are going to be ones that you want to grow, or which businesses maybe you want to expand, or not just expand, but even develop new businesses, and which ones are going to be really serious problems, serious question marks. What are you going to do? This gets into the third phase here, and that gets into implementing desired options. As I'm moving along here, I want to make sure that everyone knows that if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to submit them at any time. They will be read, and I will respond to them as soon as this presentation is over. So please get your questions, comments into me. Thank you. I presented 5 options for you to consider for your services, but let me just speak to a 6th option that I didn't include, and that's standing pat. If all your services are in the profitable range, and that the only thing you have to do is decide which ones to expand, that's fine. But what most of you will find is your services will span along all points of the grid. And I think that with so many organizations in the process of developing new services that are flexible and likely virtual, moving into a variety of markets, even if you're not seeing that happening yet, I don't think you can afford to stand still. You might, if you're more profitable, you might be able to have more time, but you can't afford to stand still. So I don't want to present that as a viable option. What is a viable option is to look at services and programs for closure. Obviously, if they are not viable from any standpoint, they're a nice thing you've been doing for your community, but they don't serve your mission, they don't serve, and they're costing you money. That's an obvious. But let me also remind you that even if it is a service that has some relation to your mission, but the drain on your finances or your ability to have any kind of reserve to be able to invest in other growth of services, if that's needed, then you may need to decide about closure for that reason as well. I guess in a final sense is, when we talk about closure of services or programs, we may not be talking about it disappearing. We may be talking about it disappearing only from your portfolio of services. There could be others in your community who can take over the program, or there can be the development of a private nonprofit that could take over that particular service, because you'll recruit a board that is more a fund development board than your board might be able to do. If you're going to look at expanding services, you're looking at basically 4 different ways of thinking about services and markets. The least risky is when you move into taking an existing service in your market and trying to expand it. So that can be something I've had experience in my market of just taking advantage of opportunities to expand crisis services, to expand services for youth who have both mental health and substance abuse services. And in both of those instances, it was not a new service and it was not necessarily a new market, but I ended up engaging more payers into the mix. And by engaging more payers, I actually made it a more viable service overall in those instances. Another example I can give you, and it's one that I've seen recently, is there's a freestanding behavioral health organization in the area where I am. It's a large enough metro area. And they, unlike any other behavioral health organization, have put some commercials on the TV talking to people about the stress they're experiencing, the anxiety, depression, the possibility that they're treating it with substances, and offering services. That's expanding into the market in a deeper way, seeing this opportunity because there is a lot of stress in the market right now, and they're trying to build on that. And so those are examples of where you may find yourself wanting to do some of those things, and it's the least risky for you. One that is a little more risky is when you take something that you're already doing and move it into a new market. So for example, if you were to, if you had a really effective service for a given population, and the other market wasn't providing that service, so let's say you could expand and create a new ACT team if the money was there, if the payers were willing to fund it. Maybe you develop a new ACT team into an area that has not provided services for people of that level of intensity, or maybe it's a program. I know I have expanded programs into market areas for evaluating and intervening with infants with developmental delays upon birth. That has some funding sources that we expanded and developed in our own market, and then took that and moved it into other markets. So that would be examples where you could do that. It's a little more risky because you're moving into a market you haven't been in, but that's where working with payers as partners is helpful. An area where you even more so have to work with payers is when you develop a new service in your current market. So for example, again, an example that I have for myself is that I have worked to develop some housing first models in a couple of different organizations that I've worked with. And it was a new service, it didn't exist. We had to put together a lot of pieces, the wraparound services, the healthcare service, housing, and so forth. However, we were able to put those pieces together because we work with payers, and I'm talking about payers and regulators as partners. We created a sense of a community need, and we were able to do that. So it's doable, but it's something that you probably want to do in a partnership with payers for sure. You may even want to do it in a partnership with other providers as kind of a way of collaborating with other providers, creating a network of services. Finally, probably the move you make with the most risk, but it has the most upside, is if you're providing a new service in a new market. And I alluded to the fact that there are providers out there who are trying to expand their place in a variety of markets by doing virtual services, even though they don't know the market, they don't necessarily know the resources and so forth. If you have a lot of faith in one of your services or a service that you know you can really build, and you have a really good partnering relationship with a payer, I think you could move a new service in a new market. So for example, care coordination. There's a lot of markets that skilled care coordination for the high risk, the high utilizer population, among whom are people that a lot of the organizations that I'm talking to right now serve. That can lead to a really great development of a service that gets supported by your payers, gets supported by the provider system that you're helping do coordination with. And if that's successful, then it's very expandable into a variety of other markets. So there's a great upside if you've got a service that a lot of people are asking for, not many people know how to do. And that gets into also knowing you've got skill sets in your organization that are adaptable to a skill set such as that. So moving forward, I do want to say that I do understand that a lot of you out there are struggling just to keep people employed, to keep services, the most vital services to people. You're dealing with a lot of different pressures, and I understand that. So going through what I just went through can sound a whole lot like that intellectual exercise, but that's not for me. And what I'm suggesting to you is this, is that you need to build in some of this work sooner than later. You might not be able to do a full-fledged strategic plan and a full-fledged service line portfolio analysis right now. Open Minds can do that for you, and we certainly would be glad to provide that. But if you're not ready for all that right now, what we do suggest, though, is that you not allow yourself to get caught up in just continuing to go from one crisis to another or just trying to survive. You do need to look forward. You need to look at your services and develop a business plan around what you're going to do. And you need to make the tough decisions, because if they're not made in the next 6 months to a year, they become harder and harder to make as things begin to take shape for the future. So I am suggesting that even though you're stressed and you're struggling, you need to be able to take the time to take a look at things before you begin to try to create a sustainable organization out of what you already were doing, without thinking about maybe something different needs to happen. All your decisions in this kind of environment are hypotheses, and sometimes you're going to be wrong, or you're going to be partially wrong. So alluding to that, housing first model. In one place that I put it together, everything fell into place. It was perfect, paid for, had a margin, plus everybody got their needs met. Another place, service was great, everything was in place, the partnerships, but the revenue didn't catch up until about 2 years in. And so when you make mistakes like that, you have to be flexible enough to make adjustments as soon as you can, and that's where help you make that. Really don't consider a mistake or a risk you might take, consider that as a failure. It's not a failure, it's an opportunity to learn, and I hope you will do that and be able to get into a knowledge-driven type of decision-making eventually as you get more experience in learning how to develop new services, how to move services into different models, how to look for different funding streams. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope we've been able to provide you with some idea about how to think about service delivery and how to think about the services or business units that you currently have and that you may be wanting to develop in the future. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mina to see if there are questions that have come in.
George, thank you so much for walking us through a very, very thorough process, which must happen, as you said, despite the struggles that we are currently undergoing. I have a question from Joe here, and the question is, you mentioned that in doing data analysis and gathering the data, that we should look at data before the crisis and data during the pandemic, right? What is the value of the data that we gather from the pandemic time? Is it just a complete outlier that we need to leave out, or is it indicative of trends that will happen in the future, or is it just crisis scenario planning kind of data?
Well, as I pointed out in one of the first slides that I went through, there were some surprising results out of this that maybe people didn't realize, such as increased productivity when you're going virtual. And people are still going to be virtual, I would guess, at least for another year, just because of mandates that are coming from the federal government and the state about limiting, how many people can be in a building and together and all that. So what you've experienced is data that can be very useful in helping you understand how you might build what you build for the future, because your service may not look like it did before. And so, I wouldn't call it all outlier data. Some of it, your judgment can be used to say, well, this is something that's never going to happen again. But I think what a lot of the virtual service delivery, what you're going to find is that there is data. The other example of data that might be useful is how effective were you at keeping people out of hospitals and residential systems and developing alternative options? And is that then a possible expansion into the future?
Great, thank you. And George, speaking of the crisis, because really, do we speak of anything else these days? Sally has a question. Based on what you're seeing happening now, other than virtual, do you have ideas about new service lines that provider organizations could be thinking about? If you were still running the community services board, what are some of the areas that you might have looked into?
Well, there's no question that service systems are still very interested in some form of integrated care coordination service delivery. So in other words, it could be integrating into a primary care system, but probably as or more important, I don't think that the potential for behavioral health providers to develop themselves into effective care coordinators for the high-risk populations has come anywhere close to being done. And so I think that is a big future area. I think another area that I think we will find is that I think that coming out of this, working with healthcare systems that have been excessively stressed, there are services that are needed even now for healthcare provider systems that are dealing with high levels of stress. And those are entrees in for bigger things, but they can be even revenue producers if you provide employee assistance programs and you develop a new program that does more stress debriefing and teaching people how to manage stress. And that could go into the general community. But I think even just if you're working with a hospital system and you can get yourself involved as part of an EAP for them or some kind of support for them, I think that can produce some really good opportunities for partnering in other ways.
Great, thank you, George. And I believe I'm just double checking here. Also just wanted to share the comment that, our CEO, Monica Oss, in a recent column, I believe earlier this week, had pointed out how a lot of the COVID-19 related deaths were linked with underlying chronic conditions and complex conditions, which really underscores the need for specialty health and human behavioral health providers to really consider integrated care as a way of taking care of the whole person in our population. So thank you for pointing out that integrated care is one of the areas that we should be looking at. Can you also talk a little bit, George, about what the competition might be like as we look at these new service lines? I know that the rest of healthcare and primary care in particular is also struggling, has been hit very hard by the pandemic. And where do you think that places us as we consider new services?
Well, the competition, and I alluded to at least one type of competition, which will be national organizations that have developed a fairly sophisticated set of virtual services that they can do anywhere in the country. I do think that that's especially in areas where managed care companies have tried to work with provider organizations and feel frustrated because they either don't want to work with the payers, or they are saying that they're saying that it's going to take them a whole lot more time to do it. When you start seeing them contracting with these kind of providers, that's going to be a serious problem for some markets. Another thing that will be, I guess you could call it a threat, will be that it is that I can't imagine that the funding won't be less from every source that you can think of, whether it be Medicaid, Medicare. It'll be less for the managed care companies to then distribute and use for behavioral health, and they'll be expecting providers, if they haven't already, they're going to expect more of a value-based or case rate service. In other words, sharing risk. And I think that the sharing risk will be harder for a lot of providers if they're not used to doing it, or they're not prepared to do it. And that in itself can really throw you off in your ability to try to recover and sustain your organization. I could probably go through a number of different things. So everything that's a risk is an opportunity. I'll just say that. If virtual opportunity for the national organizations, is also for you, because you did a magnificent job, you meaning the providers out there, in putting together a virtual service system in a very short time. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for using the virtual for almost every type of service. And if you do it in a partnership with a payer, then you are excluding some competition from coming in and taking it over instead.
I like that, George. Anything that isn't a risk is an opportunity. And I think that might be a good note for us to wrap up today, because I don't see any more questions coming in. But I do want to invite all of you, if you think of anything after this, do send us an email at info@openminds.com, and we will be happy to answer your questions or to get them to George so he can answer them for you. But once again, George, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our attendees for being with us, and wish everyone a very happy holiday weekend. Please stay safe and healthy. We'll be back next week on Thursday with our next web briefing for our elite members. So hope you'll join us then. Thank you.
Thank you.